I've lifelong been interested in topics of the supernatural. Talking about them is both enrapturing and simply fun, but when it's a personal account, the chatter sometimes is more to be found in your teeth than in the narrative. I have a personal experience with weirdness, high strangeness. You can take this a number of ways. Some of this chain I will discuss involves actual occurrences, but also mixed in are some eerie, yet luminous dreams. It begins in 1969, a long time ago. At the time, my parents lived in a lone house on a lonely street. The Riverside Flats had once been the immigrant slum of my hometown. But by the 1950s, the penultimate homes had been destroyed by the Owens Glassware Corporation to build their world's largest plant. Why this lone house at 425 Case Avenue was spared, I cannot say. It was not only the last house on the left, it was the last house that was left, period. My father rented it because he'd grown up in the flats and was nostalgic. Nostalgia debut. In my boyhood, we were surrounded by empty fields of missing homes and a copse of woods next to the dark flowing Licking River. Just outside my window was a hard ground semi-truck parking lot, and a little more distant at the end of the avenue, a somewhat futuristic hugger-mugger of pipes and industrial lamps of the plant, which was a city unto itself. At night, I would sometimes gaze longingly at those lights, taking reassurance in their activity, but then falling asleep to the basso profundo rumble of the idling big trucks. However, there was one night I wasn't asleep. My mother was up doing chores at night. It was very late. I think probably past midnight, well past, and I was allowed to hang out with her. The house was shut up against the cooling evenings because it was at least late summer. I was not quite yet 4 years old, but not far from it. It was late and dark and quiet in the house, except for the gliding in the dark of my mother's steam iron. Yeah, it's strange, but she liked to iron clothes with the lights off. I'm too young to remember what the results of that was. I made a fateful decision while she was busy to wander out into the night kitchen. I stood there looking at the sole rectangle of light beaming through the windows of the back door, which focused from a street lamp behind the house. It cast onto a grid of family photos my mother had arranged on the wall. Some people already long dead, others still current in my life. While I was staring at these hazy pictures in this low illumination, seemingly only just for a few minutes, that's when the oddest occurrence of my tiny life occurred. From beneath the level of the light and the door, a shape rose up, a shadow cast into the grid. It was a unnaturally round head with large Mickey Mouse style ears on top, and with a long, strange neck, just peeping into the house. I didn't turn around. I looked at the shadow, but I was terrified, and I screamed out, and the figure quickly dodged away. My mother came out into the kitchen, impatient to know why I'd cried out. "There was something at the window," I said. She bobbed over to the window and looked out, and like the dialogue in a bad horror movie, she said, "Well, there's nothing there now." Well, duh. We could discuss this incident rationally, couldn't we? It was probably a night peeper, disturbing as that is. I mean, after all, if this were late summer, August 1969, the Charles Manson murders on Cielo Drive and with the La Biancas had just freshly occurred. Maybe some nutter was copycatting his creepy crawls that they came across in the news. Maybe. But if so, had the peeper thought it was a good idea to don his Mouseketeer cap? Was it in early Halloweener pranks, or maybe the year was farther along than I remember? I'm going to leave this incident as it is. No conclusions. Some of you will dismiss it as the hazy mind of a small child. But that faceless, shadowy entity has lifelong fed into my bad dreams and into the dread of my life. Let's change the scene to 1975. I'm 10 years old now. What I will describe this time as a dream that I had, but you may find the content and the context both edifying. I dreamed that I was suddenly conscious in the deep night, and I was standing out in the driveway, out of doors, waiting for something. I was in my underpants and nothing else. I looked over my shoulder, and from around the house, this was a different house now, on a ridge before dense woods, and I saw the wraparound shadows stretching across the house towards me. The shadows were cast by three figures casually walking up on me. They were each those shadow people, faceless, lean voids with great Mickey Mouse ears and a Pink Panther physique of distended, skinny limbs. My attention was directed away from them temporarily by a darked-out black 1947 Buick Roadmaster cruising up into the driveway. I knew cars because we were aficionados of that and went to a car show out in Lancaster every year. I was familiar with the vehicle. The shadow people surrounded me, the trio, and walked me to the car. We climbed in. I remember there was one who got into the back and he seemed to be in charge. I mostly ignored the other two who got in the front with me. We were all the same size, so there wasn't any crowding. I focused my attention on the leader. I said, "Why do you keep taking me?" And I was annoyed. The lead shadow being said, "Well, expressed, I never saw a mouth move. I never saw a mouth." We take lots of young boys. We don't always bring them back. I copped to the threat. Turning back in my seat, I got in the faceless face and shouted, "Whatever it is you're up to, I want you to know that I'm totally against you. It said nothing, but it projected a dark mood at me, an expression of its intense loathing and disdain for me. It made me to understand that it saw me as lowly and disgusting as a cockroach in an experiment. This had the effect of shrinking my spirit. I sank pliantly into the front seat, overwhelmed by the creature's despicableness. The car backed up and took us out onto the night road. We turned away down in the other direction from the city towards a rural area. I was on the edge of town where I lived, and we soon found ourselves amongst cornfields, which I was also familiar with from my boyhood explorations. Now, we came to one of the cornfields that normatively was completely empty, except for the corn, most of the year. But this time, there was a structure there. There was a large, dark barn complex with lights coming out of the dark barn, blue lights flashing about. And we faced this, we turned towards this, and then the car began to float over the corn stalks towards the barn. Well, I changed immediately from my gloom and forgot myself, forgot my anger at my unwanted companions. I was overcome with delight at the slowly flying car. "I've got to get one of these," I said to the gruesome twosome up front with me, but they didn't respond. We landed in front of the barn, disembarked, and headed inside. As soon as the doors opened, I was suffused with a clinical white light. Abruptly, I was sitting in the waiting room of a vast doctor's office, complete with a nurse at the desk waiting for applicants. Very strange. I looked around. There were many seats, and most of them were crowded with other kids. They were around my age, some older, some younger. I remember very vividly a young brunette girl, probably no more than 19, and she was holding a baby in her arms, and it was all wrapped up in white swaddling. She seemed very upset, very nervous, scared. I looked up on the wall. There was an industrial clock, the kind you saw everywhere from the 50s on through the 80s, and it said it was sometime after 3 a.m. The next thing I know, I opened my eyes, and it was bright, late Saturday morning. The dream was over, but it had been overwhelming, vivid, exact, realistic. I never forgot this dream. But it took me years later reading alien abduction novels. I think it was that Whitley Strieber stuff that I was reading. And I began to see the obvious tropes. I'm sure many of you saw these archetypes up front because they're familiar now. And I'm sure you could ask me, and I'm not going to lie, have you at all recently seen the Invaders from Mars movie from 1953? Yeah, John Hall used to run these things on Tower Cable on holiday afternoons along with old movie serials, and definitely seen that movie. Have you read Scholastic Book Press's stuff about haunted black self-driving cars, men in black, Yetis, Peking Man, Murfreesboro monsters, Mothmen in West Virginia? Sure I had. But even so, I would kind of say in my defense that alien abductions were not so much a thing back in 1975. There was one clear story that did stand out head and shoulders, which was the Betty and Barney Hill episode. And I remember that there was a TV movie about that. But many of the tropes that we associate this commonly were not obvious back in the day. Strangely enough, I never associated any of this with UFO lore. Instead of UFO, HPL, as in H.P. Lovecraft, comes to mind. I'd read in a magazine somewhere that the horror writer who died in 1936 or 1937 had described during his childhood a childhood full of encounters with what he called the night gaunts. These were faceless, lean, rubbery, shadow void beings with curled horns on top of their head. They liked to tickle his stomach and take him places. I was only about 10 when I read about the night gaunts, and I recognized the general description. For him, they had curved horns on their heads, but I saw big round mouse ears. It sounded as if the boy HPL and myself were describing the same thing, more or less. Now, night gaunts seemed to me a pretty literary, highbrow, and highfalutin term. I just called them the rat people. I had a lot of dreams about dark sedans and black cabs, including flying cars, which flew me over wondrous cityscapes. The rat people haunted my dreams throughout my early youth. But as the old saying goes, what's in a dream? You can't take that stuff too far, right? Let me take you back to the waking world. It is now 1995 and I'm an adult. And I'm on a trip with friends to the Isle of Palms in South Carolina. We drive out over a fabulous arched bridge over the Atlantic Ocean to the Isle and to the island beach. Around then, it's comfortable noonday sun, all by a crowded beach next to the warm green Atlantic. But even there, the weirdness that sometimes interposed upon my life interposed. This is something I remember and not a dream. Dave and his girlfriend were setting up the beach blankets, and I looked over at the big, hard-packed dirt of the storm breakers above and the swank row of beach houses behind those. And something told me to go there, investigate a little bit. So without comment, I simply abandoned my friends and walked over to these big earth mounds. I quickly climbed one. When I got to the top, the Oz factor shot through the roof. So here on top of this nice sea vista, I discover on the other side of the break is a black helicopter not 12 feet away, hovering. It has no numbers and no IDs. For the most part, it looks like black primer spray paint over the frame, but there is one marking on it. There is a white shield with a thin red cross on it, not at all like the rescue operators, but it resembles the shield of the Crusades. Now the jump door is open, and inside I see at least 6 soldiers in black uniforms with helmets. Now they have no ID patches that I can discern on these uniforms. And they all have on sunglasses and black mustaches. It's a row of identical men, grim, staring, cool and unsympathetic, staring at me. At this point, I felt tremendously dizzy. Staring back at them, I felt uneasy, but somehow curiously amused. And we stood there for what seemed like just a couple of minutes. And all of a sudden, I thought to myself, I better get out of here before these guys decide to shoot me. So I turned around and I climbed back down, went back walking to my friends. Well, Dave says to me, "Where have you been all this time?" All this time? Couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. And that is a story in itself. But a few years later, I abruptly remembered the incident. Again, I think it was after I'd been reading some of those books. And I started to think about how strange the incident really was, because none of it adds up. If there were a helicopter on the other side of that break, dangerously close to the level where they might have crashed into something if there was a sudden movement or a change of the wind, well, let's forget about that. Where was the wind? Those rotors should have been kicking up a storm. I was standing on a beach hard-packed or an embankment hard-packed of basically sand. It should have tore up a small dust storm and flung that stuff into my face and eyes, and there was no wind, there was no noise, and there was no anything. It was just as if it were floating there, static. It never moved. It just hovered perfectly. Now, that doesn't add up, as I said. And that incident disturbs me more, perhaps, than any of the others, because I have such a clear, untrammeled adult memory of it. Upon reflection, what struck me was the fact that once again we're dealing with a black vehicle, figures in black, figures whose eyes and faces aren't quite typically human in the normative sense, almost like androids. And I thought to myself, maybe those helmets helped cover up their big round ears.